told they were unable to release any updates as to not compromise their investigation. Meanwhile, Sparkman's family is raising money for her two children, ages 6 and 8.
For the first time, we are hearing from the father of a mother of two who was shot and killed in a popular shopping center in the Pocket neighborhood. This as the family of Chastity Sparkman gathers for a candlelight vigil in honor of a daughter.
Welcome to the True Crime Cinema. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. There are nights that stay with you. Nights that feel ordinary from the outside. People driving home, couples finishing their dinners, families tucking their children into bed. But underneath all of that quiet normalcy, something terrible is happening. Something that will shatter a family forever. February 14th is supposed to be a night about love, about roses and candles and little handwritten notes. But for one community in Riverside, California, Valentine's Day 2024 became something no one will ever forget. It was just after 11 o'clock at night. The Maplebrook Square Shopping Center, a busy little plaza tucked near the corner of Harmon Avenue and Riverside Glen Drive, was winding down. Stores were closing. A few cars were still scattered across the parking lot. Some people were heading home after late dinners. Others were just passing through. It was the kind of place and the kind of hour that feels safe, familiar, routine. Nobody goes to a shopping center parking lot on Valentine's night expecting tragedy. But tragedy doesn't wait for a convenient moment. Riverside Police Department officers received an emergency call at approximately 11:15 that night. Someone had been shot in the Maplebrook Square parking lot. Officers rushed to the scene. And what they found there, what they saw under those cold parking lot lights, stopped them in their tracks. A young woman was lying on the ground with a gunshot wound. She was alive, but barely. Emergency medical teams from the Riverside Fire Department rushed to her side, working quickly, doing everything they could to stabilize her right there in that parking lot while the rest of the world was still sending Valentine's Day messages and falling asleep in warm beds. She was transported to a nearby hospital. Doctors and nurses took over. Hours passed, and then came the news that nobody wanted to hear. The young woman had not survived her injuries. She was gone. Police immediately opened a homicide investigation. The word homicide is clinical. It's the word law enforcement uses in their reports and their press statements. But behind that word is a human being. Behind that word is a story. And the story of this young woman, the story of what happened to her and who she was and why this happened, is one that gripped an entire community and eventually stretched all the way across the country. In those first hours after the shooting, the police said very little publicly. That's standard procedure. You don't want to tip off suspects. You don't want to contaminate witness accounts. You want to gather every piece of information carefully, quietly, and methodically. So the community was left with questions. Who was this woman? What happened? Why would someone do this on Valentine's Day night in a public parking lot, in a place where families shop and kids eat ice cream on weekends? The silence from law enforcement was necessary. But it was also agonizing for the people who knew her. Because here's the thing about a tragedy like this. The news reports call it an incident. A shooting. A homicide investigation. But the people who loved this woman didn't see a case number. They saw a daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother. They saw a chair that would now sit empty at a kitchen table. They saw two little children who would wake up the next morning and every morning after that asking where their mom was. That is what this story is really about. Not just the investigation, not just the arrests that would eventually come, but the very real, very human cost of violence. The way it ripples outward from one single moment and touches every person connected to the person who was taken. The way a community can gather in a parking lot, the exact same parking lot where it happened, holding heart-shaped balloons because they don't know what else to do with their grief. Before we get to all of that, before we talk about the investigation, the suspects, the cross-country manhunt, we need to talk about her. We need to talk about the woman whose life was taken that night. Her name was Cassandra Williams, and she deserved so much more than this. When a person dies tragically and publicly, there is a danger that happens almost immediately. Their life gets reduced to headlines, to case numbers, to a name mentioned briefly in a news segment before the anchor moves on to the next story. And that reduction, that flattening of a full, complicated, beautiful human life into a few sentences, is one of the quietest injustices that follows a violent death. So let's not do that. Let's actually talk about Cassandra Williams. Cassandra was 26 years old. 26. If you're older than that, think back to who you were at 26. Think about how much of your life was still ahead of you. Think about the things you hadn't yet figured out, the goals you were still chasing, the version of yourself you were still becoming. That's where Cassandra was. She was 26 years old, and she was in the middle of building her life. She was a mother first. That's what the people who knew her said most often, that being a mom was the center of everything for her. She had 2 children, a son who is 8 years old and a daughter who is 6. If you're a parent, you already understand what that means without me having to explain it further. Those 2 kids were her whole world. Everything she was working toward, every sacrifice she was making, every early morning and every late night, it was all for them. And she was working hard. Cassandra was enrolled at a local community college, taking classes, working toward a degree. We don't know exactly what she wanted to be. The details of her specific dreams weren't shared widely in the public reporting. But we know she had them. We know she was showing up to class, doing the work, trying to give herself and her children a better future. That takes courage. It takes discipline. It takes the kind of quiet, everyday strength that doesn't make the news but absolutely should. She was 26. She was a student. She was a mother. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's family. She had a laugh that people remembered. She had people who loved her deeply and completely. And she was shot and killed in a shopping center parking lot on Valentine's Day. In the days after the shooting, her family came forward publicly to identify her. They shared her name, her age, her story. They shared the details that the police reports couldn't capture. The human ones, the ones that matter most. And almost immediately, the community responded. Within the first week after Cassandra's death, more than 100 people gathered at the Maplebrook Square parking lot, the very place where she had been shot. They brought flowers. They brought candles. They brought heart-shaped balloons because it had been Valentine's Day when she was taken, and somehow those balloons felt like the right way to honor that. They stood together in that parking lot, and they grieved, loudly and openly, in the way that communities do when they refuse to let a person just become a statistic. Family members set up fundraising campaigns online, specifically aimed at taking care of Cassandra's 2 children. The 8-year-old boy, the 6-year-old girl, because the world had to keep moving for those kids, even when it felt completely impossible, even when nothing made sense anymore. Someone had to make sure they were fed and clothed and held and told that they were going to be okay, even when the adults around them weren't entirely sure that was true. There was also a detail that emerged in early reporting, unverified by police, so we have to be careful about how much weight we put on it, that suggested there had been some kind of argument involving Cassandra and her estranged husband earlier that same evening. Valentine's Day, a night that was supposed to be about love. Law enforcement would not confirm this account at the time, and it remained an unconfirmed thread in a story that still had many loose ends. But it planted a question in people's minds. A question that would grow louder over the following weeks as the investigation continued and more details slowly, painfully came to light. Why did this happen? And perhaps more urgently, who did this? The investigation. Here is something that most people don't fully understand about homicide investigations. They are slow. Painfully, frustratingly, sometimes maddeningly slow. Television crime dramas have given us this idea that detectives swoop in, collect a few pieces of dramatic evidence, and have their suspect in handcuffs by the end of the hour. The reality is nothing like that. Real investigations take time. They take patience. They take the painstaking work of interviewing witness after witness, reviewing hours of surveillance footage, collecting and processing physical evidence, and following lead after lead, many of which turn out to be dead ends. The Riverside Police Department's homicide detectives did exactly that kind of work in the weeks following Cassandra's death. They canvassed the Maplebrook Square area. They talked to people who had been in that parking lot that night, shoppers, employees, couples who had been out for Valentine's dinner. They pulled surveillance footage from the shopping center cameras and from nearby businesses, sitting through hours of recording, looking for anything that might tell them what happened in the minutes before and after the shooting. They collected physical evidence from the scene. They cataloged it. They analyzed it. And throughout all of this, they said very little publicly. This silence was intentional, and it was necessary. But it was also incredibly difficult for the community to sit with. The weeks after a violent death are a strange kind of limbo. The person is gone. The grief is overwhelming. But there are no answers yet. No closure. No sense of justice on the horizon. Just questions and absence. Community members and advocacy groups, particularly those focused on gun violence prevention, began asking questions publicly. They wanted updates. They wanted reassurance that this case wasn't going to slip through the cracks, that Cassandra Williams wasn't going to be forgotten the way that some victims of gun violence tragically are. The police responded consistently. The investigation is active. We are working every available lead, and we cannot share details that might compromise our progress. It's a difficult balance. The public deserves to know that justice is being pursued. But the investigation also needs to be protected. Detectives had to walk that line carefully every single day. What became clear, gradually, was that this case was not going to be solved within the city limits of Riverside alone. As detectives followed the evidence and tracked persons of interest, it became increasingly clear that whoever they were looking for had not stayed in California. The trail was leading elsewhere, potentially far elsewhere. This realization triggered a significant escalation in the investigation. Local homicide detectives began coordinating with regional law enforcement agencies and, critically, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI's involvement in what had started as a local homicide case signaled something important. This was no longer just a Riverside investigation. This had become a multi-jurisdictional pursuit. Resources were pooled. Information was shared. The search expanded. And then the investigators got a break. Details about exactly what evidence led investigators to their conclusion were not made public, and that's completely understandable from a legal standpoint. Those details will matter enormously in court, and prosecutors need to protect the integrity of that evidence. But somewhere in the weeks of painstaking, careful investigative work, the picture came into focus. The detectives knew who they were looking for. They knew the names. They had a strong enough case to pursue arrests. The question was, where were these people? The answer, as it turned out, was about 2,800 miles away. The arrest across the country. There is something almost cinematic about the moment a fugitive is caught. And I say that not to glamorize it, because this is not a movie, and there is nothing glamorous about any of this. I say it because when law enforcement finally announced that arrests had been made in this case, the location of those arrests was genuinely shocking to people who had been following the story. New York City. Not the next town over. Not somewhere else in California. New York City. One of the largest, most densely populated cities in the entire world. Nearly 3,000 miles from that parking lot in Riverside. Nearly 3,000 miles from where Cassandra Williams lost her life. In March 2024, roughly a month after the shooting, Riverside police, working in close coordination with the FBI, located
At that time,
and arrested
nobody
two
knew
suspects
who
in
was
New York
responsible.
City. The
But the
operation
family had their
required the kind of
suspicions,
interagency
especially because they
cooperation
knew who
that
she was
doesn't
meeting
happen
with that
easily
day.
or quickly.
Late night
It
shooting
required
in a
trust
shopping center
between
parking
local
lot.
and federal law enforcement.
A slew
It
of
required
emotions
resources
hit as
and
this
coordination and the willingness of multiple agencies to share information and work toward a common goal. And it worked. The two suspects taken into custody were identified as 25-year-old Marcus Grant and 25-year-old Deja Holloway. Let's talk about who these people were in relation to Cassandra, because the relationship context matters here, even though it also raises enormously painful questions. Marcus Grant, according to Riverside Police, was Cassandra Williams' estranged husband. Estranged, meaning they were separated, not living together as a couple in the process of disconnecting from their marriage. And Deja Holloway was identified as Marcus Grant's girlfriend.
Take a moment with that.
Because this is where the story moves from being painful to being almost unbearable. The woman who was shot and killed on Valentine's Day night was the estranged wife of one of the suspects. And the other suspect was that man's new girlfriend. We don't know, because law enforcement had not publicly confirmed it, exactly what the nature of the conflict was, or What specifically led to the shooting? We don't know whether this was premeditated, carefully planned, or whether it erupted from a confrontation that got out of control. Those are questions that would need to be answered in a courtroom.
But we know the outline.
And the outline is heartbreaking. Cassandra Williams was 26 years old. She was a student. She was a mother of 2 young children. She was trying to build a life for herself and her kids. And according to law enforcement, the 2 people charged in connection with her murder were her estranged husband and his girlfriend. Both Marcus Grant and Deja Holloway were arrested on charges related to homicide and were to be extradited back to California to face those charges. The word extradition sounds procedural and bureaucratic, and in many ways it is. But what it means practically is that these 2 individuals would be brought back to Riverside to stand in a courtroom and answer for what allegedly happened to Cassandra in that parking lot. For Cassandra's family, the arrests must have brought a complicated mixture of feelings. Relief, perhaps, that the people law enforcement believed were responsible had been found, that they hadn't disappeared, that the system had worked at least this far, but also anger and grief. And the particular kind of devastation that comes when violence reaches into your own family, when the person responsible for taking someone you love is someone who was once part of that same family. For her 8-year-old son and her 6-year-old daughter, the arrests probably meant very little in the immediate sense. Children at those ages don't process justice systems and extradition hearings. They process absence. They notice that their mother hasn't come home. They wake up in the middle of the night and they reach for someone who isn't there anymore. That is what the arrests couldn't fix. That is what no verdict, no sentencing, no legal outcome will ever fully fix. But it mattered. The arrests mattered. Because justice, imperfect, slow, incomplete as it always is, still matters. What we're left with. We've reached the part of the story where I don't have a tidy ending to give you. And I think that's important to acknowledge honestly, rather than try to wrap this up in a way that feels more resolved than it actually is. When this story was reported on, the legal process was still in its early stages. Extradition, formal charges, arraignment, pre-trial hearings. The long, grinding machinery of the criminal justice system, which moves slowly and deliberately by design. The specific roles of each suspect, exactly what Marcus Grant did, exactly what Deja Holloway did, and precisely how the events of that Valentine's night unfolded, had not been publicly confirmed. The evidence that tied them to the scene had not been laid out in open court. Motives had not been officially declared. All of that was still to come. And so, in one sense, the story of what happened to Cassandra Williams was still unfinished. It would continue to unfold in courtrooms, in legal filings, in the careful and deliberate process of a criminal trial. Whether the evidence would support conviction. What sentences, if any, would be handed down. Whether justice, in the fullest sense of that word, would ultimately be served. Those questions remained open. But here's what I want to say about that, because I think it matters more than any verdict or legal outcome. Justice, even when it comes, doesn't undo the loss. Cassandra Williams' 2 children, that 8-year-old boy, that 6-year-old girl, they will grow up without their mother. That is a permanent fact, regardless of what happens in any courtroom. They will have birthdays without her. They will graduate from things without her. They will have moments of joy and moments of heartbreak and moments where they desperately, achingly need their mom, and she won't be there. She can't be there. Because she was taken from them in a parking lot on Valentine's Day when she was 26 years old and still in the middle of building her life. That reality doesn't change. And that reality is why stories like this one matter. Not because they're dramatic. Not because they involve cross-country manhunts and FBI investigations and arrests in New York City. But because behind every headline about a shooting, behind every case number in a police report, behind every statistic about gun violence, there is a person. A full, complicated, irreplaceable human being. There are children who lose a parent. There are parents who lose a child. There are communities that gather in parking lots holding heart-shaped balloons because they don't know what else to do with their grief. More than 100 people came to that shopping center parking lot in the weeks after Cassandra was killed. Think about that. More than 100 people stood in the place where she died, holding balloons on a cold night because she mattered to them. because her life had touched their lives, because they needed somewhere to go with their love and their loss. That's not a statistic. That's a community in pain. And community pain, collective grief, is something we don't talk about enough when we talk about violence. We talk about suspects. We talk about charges. We talk about sentences. But we don't always talk about the long aftermath. The years of healing that a community has to do after losing one of its own. The way violence echoes forward through time, affecting not just the people who were there that night, but the children and the families and the neighborhoods that are left to rebuild in the wake of it. Cassandra Williams was working toward her degree. She was going to class, trying to build a future, trying to give her kids something better. That story, the story of a 26-year-old mother fighting for herself and her children, should have continued for decades. It should have had chapters we'll now never get to read. So, as this case continues to move through the courts, as legal proceedings unfold over the coming months, remember the person at the center of it all. Remember that her name was Cassandra. Remember that she had 2 kids who loved her completely. Remember that she was in the middle of her story when it was cut short. And if you're someone who followed this case, or if someone you love has been touched by violence, or if you're just a person sitting somewhere watching this video wondering why any of this happens, know that you're not alone in asking that question. These are the hardest questions we have, and we owe it to people like Cassandra to keep asking them. Rest in peace, Cassandra. You deserved so much more time. Thanks for your watching. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to the True Crime Cinema for meaningful stories that inspire and teach life lessons.